Good afternoon and welcome to the latest in the series of our BSI lunchtime webinars. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and as you can see from the screen, this afternoon's topic will be BS 8644 Part 1, Digital Management of Fire Safety Information. So just before we get into the main part of today's webinar, we'll just cover off the usual housekeeping information, which I'm sure everybody is very familiar with by now. If you've joined these things before, this is a listen-only webinar, but it is being recorded. We welcome all of your questions via the Q&A function that you'll be able to see in the tab on the right. After the presentations, we'll hold a short Q&A session at the conclusion of the presentations. So simply click on the Q&A button on the side panel to post any questions you'd like us to try and tackle. If by any chance you do experience technical difficulties, please submit this issue via the Q&A function and our team will do their best to help. And upon completion of the feedback survey that you'll be sent, BSI will send you a link to a recording of the webinar in due course. This is also a CPD recognised webinar, so please request your certificate via the feedback survey as well following the webinar. So just by means of introduction, my name is Ian Richardson. I'm one of the sector leads at BSI in the Built Environment team. Hopefully everybody knows who BSI is, but the British Standards Institution is the national standards body for the UK. We develop solutions for industry and businesses and are also the member of the European standards bodies, CERN and CENELEC, and the international bodies ISO and IEC. So today we'll be covering off BS 8644 Part 1. I have with me Aman Sharma, who is the Managing Director of Totus Digital. Aman is also the Deputy Chair of the Building Regulations Advisory Committee, BRAC, where he's responsible for leading on fire safety in Part B, and also Deputy Chair of the BRAC Golden Thread Working Group. Aman is an experienced non-executive director, worked extensively with a number of industry partners, including regulators, local and national government, design houses, developers and housing associations. But Aman also chairs our BSI Technical Committee FSB 111, leading on the delivery of BS 8644. So no one is better placed to deliver the information we're going to give you today. So welcome and thanks to you, Aman, and I'll pass over to you.
Thank you very much, Ian, and good afternoon to everyone who's joined us this lunchtime. It's a pleasure to be back at the BSI monthly series of webinars, which have been running for some time now, but focused on a plethora and a really extensive range of not just building safety issues, but issues pertaining to building safety, such as sustainability. It really is a pleasure to be back discussing BS 8644 Part 1, as we reached a critical point within the development phase of this multi-part series during the summer. It would be remiss of me to not extend my thanks to the drafting panel and the broader technical committee for all the work that they've done during the development of Part 1 of this series, some 5 years in the making following that horrific night in June 2017. I'd also like to take this opportunity to place on record my thanks to all of you who may have engaged with this work in any capacity that you've done so, particularly those individuals that submitted extensive comments during the draft public consultation of this standard. British standards are developed by consensus. Not everyone can hold the pen. However, it is critical that those across the industry continue to contribute to the development of standards. And of course, those development phases do not end at the publication stages of British, European and international standards, respectively, as we come to learn about the adoption and changes across industry. So I would encourage you to continue to make those contributions. They are critical and useful. So today I intend to cover BS 8644, but it would be folly of me to try and do that without at least discussing the Building Safety Act and then the golden thread, which many of you will recognise as critical to how we go on to design and construct and operate buildings across our built environment within this new regime for high-risk buildings across the English regulatory regime. So as we move on to the next slide, we'll start with some of the tenets of the Building Safety Act. The Act is in 6 parts, forming 11 schedules, and as you can see, 171 clauses. It suffered over some 300 amendments during its parliamentary process during the Commons and the Lords, respectively. And that's, of course, to be expected. Such was the gravitas and the locus that the Act sets out. Perhaps rather poignantly, given events in the last couple of weeks, the Act formed a significant part of our late Queen's 3 previous speeches, and as she set out her government's intentions to take forward reform within the building safety world. But perhaps most critically, this is a generational reform programme for how we design, construct and operate buildings, overhauling the plethora of building regulations that we have in existence today and introducing some new concepts for building safety too. And if we move on to the next slide, we can cover some of the high level elements, and these are just some aspects of what the Building Safety Act sets out to do. Perhaps most recognisable, it will establish a new building safety regulator with a locus to enforce building safety for all buildings in England, and parts 3 and 4 respectively of the Building Safety Act set out some nuances for those higher risk buildings and the creation of those powers to regulate design, construction and operation. And we'll explore some of that over the course of the next 40 minutes or so. Critical to Dame Judith's recommendations was the resident's voice, and the Building Safety Act is very clear, as it's now on the statute books, about how it intends to do that, with further detail coming in through the secondary legislation which is being worked through. The scope of the Defective Premises Act is extended extensively for those that have been watching that particular development unfold. And of course, we'll have a new clear oversight framework for construction products, and indeed a new regulator for construction products, which will sit in the OPSS. Again, perhaps most significantly, the pursuit to drive industry cultural change across the range of activities that we associate with design, construction and operations of buildings is by far and away the most standout element that Dame Judith identified within her independent review published in 2018. The Act does address that directly, and of course we'll see further development during the development of the statutory instruments and secondary legislation which are currently being consulted on. And I very much hope as we move to the next slide, that all of you have had an opportunity to explore those consultations in greater detail. I'm assured that those links will be made available to you via the chat function. So if you haven't got around to doing that yet, please do. This is your opportunity to engage directly with government and understand a bit more about those policy positions that are associated with the secondary legislation that will support the delivery of the Building Safety Act. And as you can see, they're broken down into 3 particular distinct areas, focusing on Part 3, or design and construction, and Part 4, in occupation, for regime for occupied high-risk buildings, respectively. This is important because there are nuances for a number of elements within the Act as it's set out within those respective parts, and that is the same, of course, for Golden Thread. And Golden Thread is an integral underpinning tenet for the development of BS 8644. So it's really important to understand the government position on what the Golden Thread is, how industry has supported the development of that policy up to the point of this all-important consultation, and furthermore how that's contextualized and put forward, proposed as a methodology to adopt those principles within standards such as BS 8644 Part 1. So as we move on to the next slide, we'll tackle the definition of the Golden Thread, a hotly debated topic across various webinars and online events and in-person events and exhibitions. We see this being discussed in great detail wherever we go. But really the baseline point to understand the definition of the golden thread is the BRAC Golden Thread Report, which was published by the government in July 2021. It was in early 2021 that Dame Judith asked BRAC to form the Golden Thread Working Group, with the sole purpose, of course, to allow for an appropriate vehicle and conduit into industry to inform the development of this key policy for the building safety case regime. And one of the first things we sought to do was provide an industry-wide and accepted definition. And here it is in front of you. So the golden thread being the information that allows you to understand the building, your building, and the steps needed to keep both the building and people safe now and in the future. And that's further broken down into this two-part definition, which really just deals with the information requirements and the information management process that would be needed to deal and manage those information requirements. And as we move on to the next slide, we can explore that in a little bit more detail. So the application of this concept applies at a government level and within the safety case regime specifically for higher risk buildings as such. So these are buildings that are at least 18 meters in height or have at least 7 stories. But critically, part B of that definition, the Secretary of State can effectively specify that scope as he or she see fits on at a particular point in time. And that's important as we develop our understanding and learning on the applicability of this regime, the value that it's bringing, and also some of the remediations that may need to take place as well. There are some considerations, of course, for some hospitals and care homes that will meet that height threshold, which also will be required to do this, and limited really for the design and construction process only. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Those who have looked at the Golden Thread report will recognise the 10 principles that are introduced. They are repeated in the live consultation and very much form the baseline for the policy positions set out. These are the principles by which the Golden Thread should be delivered, and the difficult task now is obviously to formalise these within legislation, and our friends within DLUC and HSE respectively will use the analysis that's submitted from the consultation to help do that, to again shape how these principles will be delivered in law. So it's not my intention to explore these in intrinsic detail for the purposes of a lunch and learn session. However, both within the BRAC Golden Thread report and the live consultations respectively, you will see far more detail than I could provide you in this short period that we have together on what it means to have a principle relating to security, accountability, accessibility when we discuss the Golden Thread. And again, I'd encourage you all to have a look at that and cascade that across your relevant networks. So as we move on to the next slide, I'd like to talk a little bit about how the Golden Thread applies during the design and construction process, or part 3 of the Building Safety Act, which you might hear me refer to for the rest of this session. As we can see, applicants will be expected to undergo the building control approval applications process, and that information should set out how the building will satisfy, and this is really critical to understand, all applicable functional requirements of the building regulations have been met. So these are the circa 600 or so developments that we'll see going through the design and construction process during the first iterations and the first phases of that new safety case regime for higher risk buildings. The Golden Thread, the body of that information, will be underpinned by evidence base, a robust and demonstrable evidence base that sets out that demonstrable means to satisfy all functional requirements of the building regulations, a key point to remember. Also, how the building work conforms to the design that was approved, including any approved changes. And you can see in the ultimate bullet point there that we set out a change control log as a means to be able to do that. But we all recognise the fact that an original design intent very often doesn't stay that way, and when those change controls are or when those changes are identified as necessary to meet a particular functional requirement of the building regulations, how is that compliance still demonstrable in the same way that it was before? And that's information that is expected to be stored in the golden thread. And as we move on, we'll explore how that information evolves throughout that process and some of the information deliverables that will sit alongside that. So the applications must contain sufficient information to show how the building conforms to the approved design, and again, satisfying all the applicable functional requirements, and that can comprise as-built plans, information that's captured during the construction phasing, information captured through commissioning, and indeed functional inspections of any of those systems that are associated with the building. Again, all information that should be stored in the golden thread. And if we can move on, we can see that that will differ ever so slightly for those buildings that are classed as falling into scope of Part 4 of the Building Safety Act, so in occupation, higher risk buildings. And as you can see, that information, as opposed to, quite conversely to this idea of meeting and demonstrating evidence base for all the functional requirements of the building regulations, limiting more so to now just fire and structural safety. We estimate that there's approximately around 13,000 of these high-risk buildings around the regulatory regime where this will be applied. And of course, a degree of proportionality needs to be considered within being able to determine legacy information that either isn't simply there anymore or wasn't there in the first instance, and apply that proportionality. So limiting that information to fire and structural safety is a means to be able to do that, but also recognizing that there will be information that can be captured in a historical way. So we know there are ways to sample material, there are ways to scan parts of the asset or indeed the whole of the asset to begin capturing and structuring information that is an acceptable way to the accountable person and present that evidence to the future building safety regulator, but that will be decided on a, I would suggest, a duty holder by duty holder basis. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll come to the end of this particular section shortly and then start tackling how BS 8644 can set out a means to do that for fire. This is a key concept, really, what you see before your screen here, the principal accountable person and accountable person assessing and managing building safety risks, ensuring that they capture the information they need to demonstrate the effective management of risk of fire spread and risk of structural failure. It's this concept that Dame Judith introduced and has brought over from those high hazard industries, and some of you may be from such industries, so we'll recognise some of these principles, and in particular the introduction of a safety case, of using relevant, accurate and accessible information to demonstrate how a set of risks are being suitably and sufficiently mitigated. This is something that Dame Judith and her team identified as just simply not being done, and where it was being done, perhaps not being done as effectively as it could be. We've really got to move away from this culture of submitting deliverables and allowing information to be a byproduct of action, and rather thinking about information as a commodity in itself to help enable better levels of building safety. And that applies both to those in occupation buildings falling under the scope of Part 4 of the Building Safety Act, and of course those for Part 3 going through their design and construction process for the first time. So as we move on to the next slide, you'll see some, we'll start to explore some of the concepts of how finally BS 8644 can help deliver against some of those principles. I want to start on the next slide by sort of introducing a bit of history as to why we started first looking at this concept. As I said, the initial scoping sessions and roundtable discussions around a standard for the digital management of fire safety information happened in December 2017, so quite a while ago now. And of course, those of you will recognise that that fell in between that space of the interim report being issued by Dame Judith and her final report. Thankfully, we had the benefit of access into Dame Judith's team and obviously Dame Judith herself to understand a bit more about how her work was going and how future guidance that she wanted to see developed could help deliver against that. But ultimately, her final report concluded as thus. She recorded that unanimous concern surrounding an ineffective operation of the rules around the management, as I would describe it, of building and fire safety information. And management infers, a number of different actions, including, as Dame Judith described, the creation, maintenance, handover, exchange of building safety information. And as I alluded to earlier on, where it was happening and where that building information was present, it was just simply often the case that it was not in a suitable form, and certainly not in an accessible format for those people who needed to see it. And there are two groups in particular that spring to mind, I'm sure, to all of us when we think about the accessibility of that building, and in this case, fire safety information. And those groups who need to have that access into it. And of course, that for me is the residents and occupants of these buildings, and also the fire and rescue service, and those who have been following the public inquiry, which is finally going into its conclusion phases, and Sir Martin reports on his phase 2 recommendations. Will recognise some of the challenges that have been very difficult to hear in why those blockers were in place at a inherently industry level, and perhaps some of the scrupulous actions that have been embedded within our culture, which we are now desperately trying to unpack. I think on the next slide, it's also equally helpful to understand some of the excerpts from the call for evidence that helped inform Dame Judith's work in particular. And I always reflect on London Fire Brigade's very, very good submission, in my opinion, and their reflections on the handover of fire safety information as it related to Regulation 38, and the consideration that they made that not only should it be made an offence under the fire safety order, which of course is not the case and won't be the case, but certainly it will be an offence to do so under the Building Safety Act and the secondary that will support it. But their position of, I would suggest, not quite conjecture or subjectivity, but certainly objectivity as an authority having jurisdiction, that it was often not done well in terms of handing fire safety information over after construction work had been completed to the responsible person, and there being insufficient evidence of enforcement action taken where it hadn't been undertaken appropriately. And again, that's very much in the context of Regulation 38 being an enforceable part of the building regulations, and anecdotal evidence telling us in quite significant but sad detail that, as we move on to the next slide, those building control bodies and local authorities that did try and enforce against this requirement and regulation, where they had recognised it hadn't taken place, found that it wasn't within their gift to keep doing so, because the fines often didn't outweigh the cost of taking some of these duty holders through that process. And again, those observations carried through from London Fire Brigade's observations there as well, specific to Regulation 38, and the approach that they had observed in the past, which didn't prove helpful. Now, at this point, what I should stress is that whilst we had conversations at this point as to whether we were producing a standard for just the golden thread within the context of the higher risk building and safety case regime, were we trying to produce a piece of work that would set out what good looks like for Regulation 38, we ultimately decided that a British standard being applicable across the entire Great Britain area should be a bit more forward thinking, and certainly proportionate to those different regimes that operate a building control schema, but also the fire safety information requirements and handover requirements that exist within those devolved administrations as well. So the BS that we are discussing today certainly is not a Regulation 38 specific piece of work, but certainly can be applied to that process to help demonstrate what good looks like for that particular requirement. So one of the first things I did, as you can see on the next slide, was set my committee the task of agreeing some strategic objectives. What were we trying to achieve with BS 8644? And you can see them there. There was agreement that we needed to develop a standard information management approach for the fire safety sector, while simultaneously developing that capability and also competency of information management across that same sector. And finally, it ultimately needed to be able to produce and be demonstrable in producing best practice for effective fire safety information management throughout the life cycle of an asset that was digital by default. So you can recognise some of those concepts that we pulled out from the work that Dame Judith did, but also some of those observations that were made through the thematic responses during the call for evidence as well. Some of those key tenets being a digital process by default. There really was only one place to help us formulate that thinking, recognizing the capacity, recognizing the capability of the fire safety sector in terms of information management. There was an evidence case enough that clearly something was wrong that was preventing an effective and standard information exchange process that led Dame Judith to her conclusions. So it was simply not the case that something wasn't being adopted that was already out there. And indeed, during some of the early exploration processes before most British standards are developed, is what guidance is available already. And during that initial scoping, or those initial scoping sessions, we unearthed at least 4 projects that had been stood up by various organisations, critically not within BSI, actually, interestingly, that had looked at something similar in this space, but for one reason or another had fallen over. And inherently, one of the key and recurring themes as to why they didn't quite carry through to completion was a lack of an ability to actually arrive at a consensus of what good looked like for that guidance, with lots of disparate thinking and subjectivity feeding into those processes. The wonderful thing about developing standards under the governance of BSI is that it has to be consensus driven, and you just simply have to find a way through those processes to get to a point in time where there is a standard that can be widely adopted. So the frameworks under BS Naught, recently updated, of course, allowed us to be able to do that. It was clear to me as well that one of the underpinning tenets to this project was to bring together an already established philosophy, set of standards, and thinking under the UK BIM framework, and enhance that knowledge and understanding across a sector that just simply was not quite there yet in the fire safety sector, and trying to bridge the gap between those two sectors without trying to reinvent anything relating to information management was a very critical objective that we all agreed was something we wanted to carry through, and we've done that through introducing some of the concepts of the BSE and ISO 19650 series, which, as you can see from the next slide, formed one of the most significant drafting principles that I asked the drafting panel and the technical committee to agree before actually scribbling words on on paper to start developing the standard. So as you can see there, the first one that was agreed was that the standard should be relevant to developments who use BIM and also don't use building information modeling protocols. I often describe 8644 and the multi-part series that will be 8644 as a bridging standard for those who are on their own learning journeys with information management, as those from the BIM community will be more familiar with, but who absolutely need to recognise that there is a sector out there, and probably others as well, that don't quite understand those concepts and principles as well as some of our BIM experts do. And I'm an absolute champion of purporting and speaking positively to the work that the UK BIM framework has done and will continue to do. And I'll speak a little bit more about how this will evolve towards the end of this session. But it was absolutely critical to recognise that those within the fire safety sector, those individuals that actually develop fire safety information, recognising the technical expertise that's required to develop that information, needed to onboard their thinking on how some of the concepts and principles described on the UK BIM framework apply to their particular discipline. The second one was a good and constructive debate on the scope of BS 8644. I've spent some time talking about the Building Safety Act, Part 3 of the Act, Part 4 of the Act, and how the scope applies to those higher risk buildings. I need to be absolutely clear. The scope of this standard covers all parts of the built environment. Information management is information management wherever it is in the built environment, and information requirements are proportionate to those assets that fall in scope of a particular development. We wanted to be ambitious, and we wanted to try and future-proof this work as far as we reasonably could, and it was agreed that extending the scope beyond those, and this is also critical to recall as well, as yet as it was then undefined definition of what buildings were falling into scope of that new safety case regime would be not as productive as one would hope. So this scope, or the scope of 8644, does cover all parts of the built environment and can be applied, and indeed is being applied on some projects that have been brought to my attention on an international level, and some of the major infrastructure programs that we see quite readily in our news headlines as well, which is really encouraging to see. The third one there, and I've already alluded to it, was that we needed to come up with some subconscious ways, I would describe, of enhancing the knowledge and understanding of, in particular, the BSE and ISO 19650 series and the wider guidance that's included within the UK BIM framework. The idea being is that if fire safety experts or consultants or engineers were picking up 8644 for the first time without any knowledge of the UK BIM framework or building information modelling, by the end of that first read, they should be able to interface with elements of the UK BIM framework and start recognising terminology, processes, protocols, and workflows, etc. Hence, going back to the philosophy of describing this as a bridging standard to the UK BIM framework. And invariably, as a byproduct of those three principles, we would very much hope to be able to evidence that that those processes do enable better communication and information management. And lastly, again, something that my committee spent a good amount of time discussing, and rightly so, was at what point during a building's life cycle this guidance should be applicable. And we agreed on the value of that reciprocity, as it were. So essentially this being a standard that can be applied during those buildings already in occupation and those going through their planning, design and construction process for the first time. And as we move on to the next slide, and to hopefully just reinforce the point that whilst the golden thread as it relates to building safety policy and in design and construction applies to all applicable building regulations, it really is the management of that information that forms the fundamental part of those golden thread processes. You can recognise some I hope anyway, some really key words within that last paragraph, notably management or managing, trust, accurate, access, and you can see why these are some of the lines that we like to use consistently when discussing this. The golden thread does form a fundamental component of the standard that we are describing, and builds upon those principles that we've just discussed, cascaded across a wider part of the built environment, recognising, of course, that it's the Building Safety Act itself that retains the clause to upscope those buildings that immediately will fall into scope of the building safety case regime. So there could be a time in the very near future where we are talking about a significantly increased proportion of the built environment that falls under that new safety case regime, and the Secretary of State will make his or her decision on that as the evidence presents itself as to the value of being able to do it. So key standards like this and others being able to apply and, as I say, future-proof themselves to allow for that to happen seems like a sensible thing to do to me. So moving on to the next slide, and just again reinforcing the point that it's part 4 of the Act that requires the Golden Thread of Information to limit itself to those risk mitigations relating to the spread of fire and structural failure. We'll see on this next slide that the coming together of those 2 aspects, i.e. part 3 and 4, means that BS 8644 can provide an information management process for both those categories of buildings and also other buildings across the built environment, as we've already covered, from which users can begin to define their fire safety information requirements. It's probably quite clear to those who are client side of these types of projects that you're going to achieve greater levels of efficacy for effective fire safety information management when defined by clients or appointing parties. But I often describe a push-pull strategy when we're enabling that cultural change. If those organisations that are appointing information management experts or indeed fire safety experts to undertake certain deliverables or complete certain deliverables for them, we really do need to take responsibility to help educate those clients and appointing parties into what those future requirements will be, if it is indeed a building falling in scope of this regime, or quite frankly, what is the right thing to do to enable the most effective use of the information that you are creating for them. So it's probably time that we start looking at some of the aspects of the standard itself. And the first thing to do on the next slide is describe the fire safety information management framework, which if we click on further, you will see is made up of 7 information exchange points. BS 8644 Part 1 is a code of practice. It's not a specification, which means that this can act as a baseline to develop a framework on a project basis or an organizational basis to underpin the delivery of the fire safety information exchange that individual organizations want to overlay on existing processes or indeed build from scratch. You can see at the center point there, broadly speaking, the 4 fire safety objectives from which fire strategies are developed to around life safety, property protection, environmental protection, and business continuity. And users of the UK BIM framework will recognise the BS 8536 plan of work overlay into what you see before you. But in reality, there are multiple plans of works, including, of course, REBAs and CICs. There are plan of works associated to high hazard industries such as rail as well, which, again, this being a code of practice rather than a specification, can be used in conjunction with those plans of work. The 7 information exchange points then set out key milestones within a project or, again, organisational frameworks that fire safety information should be exchanged between one party to another. And it covers, of course, briefing, design, construction, handover in use. We added the end of life phase after some very helpful comments at draft public consultation, because invariably when an asset becomes defunct and is demolished, you enter back into that briefing, design and construction phase, which is why that reciprocal and wheeled concept works quite particularly well. Information exchange point G deals with fire and rescue service intervention, for anyone wondering what FRS was, and as you can see is relevant at multiple stages of an asset's life cycle, including construction, in use, and indeed back into that end of life phase. And that exists both within an emergency response context, but also a statutory context for those who are operating in building control regimes where one of their authorities, and I suspect this is the case for most regulatory regimes, is the fire and rescue service. So this standard discusses the information requirements that need to be considered and exchanged at a specific point in time within their projects that deal with an emergency response, and also deal with those information requirements that are relevant to statutory consultations. If we can move on to the next slide, please, and we are coming to the end and the all-important Q&A. 8644 Part 1 introduces a new structure that enables the physical exchange of that fire safety information. And FIRE, which stands for the Information Exchange for Fire Safety Information, is essentially a non-proprietary structure for fire engineers, either like myself or others, or building owners, to be able to set out a standardized way to store, name, exchange their fire safety information. And this can be done very simply on an Excel spreadsheet. It can be done using an XML as well, and more complicated structural methodologies, which is described in further detail within the standard itself. And I'd encourage you all to have a look at that. I'll ask if we can move on to the next slide, please. So I've already described there that it provides that means to manage fire safety information, and also importantly link documentation between all relevant parties throughout a project, or indeed the life cycle of an asset. Cultural change is going to take a very long time, and I'm sympathetic to those wanting to rid ourselves of documentation. But the reality is, on some of the world's biggest infrastructure projects, we deal with PDF and documentation, and we probably will be doing for a little while longer yet. But having a structure that can link to the relevant documents, I'm sure anyone working on not even major projects will bemoan the time that they spend just looking for the relevant documents on a particular project. But having the benefits of a common data environment and an electronic document management system linked to a linked structure like FIRE will help to reduce that time, but also recognize the capabilities again and the capacity within those sectors that are responsible for producing this technical information that's related to fire safety. It will also help facilitate that information exchange at each information exchange point as well. So for those project milestones as well, for that information exchange to take place at a key point in time, FIRE offers a methodology to be able to do that. Most significantly, this is an enabling tool to begin developing the fire safety sector's understanding of a standard information management approach. The reason I pushed this to become a multi-part series was because the job is not done yet with this standard. We are on a journey with our cultural approach to fire safety information management, and that journey is continuing. We are looking at phases or parts 2 and 3 to 8644 already. And as early as February of this year, we had already begun discussing with key industry stakeholders how we can further develop some of the aspects and concepts that are introduced within 8644, while simultaneously those within the fire safety sector, again, the individuals that produce fire safety information, are undertaking their own development assessment pathways for information management, as we have previously described. So there are a few spinning plates here that need to be considered, but the most critical, and I'm pleased to say, is that we'll be working in conjunction with the Executive Council from the UK BIM Alliance to stand up a working group to develop a dedicated schema for FIRE. That working group will consist of the great and good from the information management and data sectors and the fire safety sector, respectively, before coming back into the machine of BSI to form an updated part 2 and potentially a part 3 as well, depending on how substantive those outputs are. And I think we can move on to the next slide here at this point. And this is the final slide, you'll be pleased to hear. I will stress again that need for a cultural change to how we think about fire safety. I think with all of this, we have, beyond anything else, opportunity for anyone involved in fire safety to think differently about how we all design or play our part in the design, construction or maintenance of fire safety in all of our buildings, let alone higher risk buildings. And whilst we have a building safety regulator coming online to act as a building control body for higher risk buildings, that will be a regulator for all buildings at the same time. That's a really important point to remember. So within that cultural change, we need to recognize that opportunity to think differently about how we're embedding those information management processes within fire engineering or generic fire safety practices associated with risk management in the in-occupation phase, while simultaneously recognizing the significant capacity and capability issues that we are currently experiencing in the fire sector. There are a record low of fire engineers available across our community at the moment, and putting too much too soon and not considering the proportionate approaches that we can take to this cultural change would be remiss of us all, I would suggest. And as I say, I look forward to further developing not just this standard, but associated standards too with our key industry partners. And I assure everyone that that's happening in earnest. And I very much look forward to updating you all on how that unfolds. So, Ian, I think that's my last slide. I just say thank you to everyone for listening to me for the past 40 minutes or so, and very much look forward to the Q&A.
Yes, fantastic. Really appreciate that, Amanda, and a great journey there from Building Safety Act golden thread through to the standard. And as you say, with less than 15 minutes to go, as you can imagine, with the amount of detail that's out there now with this particular standard that published, I believe, back in July, so reasonably wet ink still. Lots of questions have come in. Some were submitted before the event, some during. So we'll just try and tackle as many as we can, if that's okay with you, over the next sort of 10 minutes before we end. So you talked about the first one here, enhancing knowledge and understanding of the 19650 series and the UK BIM framework. So what would you say the steps would need to be in order to begin implementing BIM standards?
So the absolute first place to go for anyone wanting to know a little bit more about building information modelling in general, or some of the standards associated with building information modelling, is the UK BIM framework. A lot of resource has been spent and a lot of input has been made by industry experts, international and national experts, I should say, to putting together a very robust and very understandable framework of guidance that can help onboard organizations and indeed sectors as well, which is what we're trying to do here, in approaching information management in a standardized way. I talked about not wanting to reinvent the wheel earlier on, Ian. It would have been remiss of us all to try and set out an alternative approach when UK PLC itself has invested so significantly into BIM, and we see that now with references to the value of BIM during Dame Judith spoke very clearly within her report, but also that's been further affirmed through the publication of the Construction Playbook, but also Professor David Mossey's research into the procurement piece around how this will help unlock greater value and can do so in a standardized way. Ultimately, the philosophy is a really clear one, I think. Ensuring that the right people have the right information at the right time shouldn't take multiple different approaches to enable that philosophy to become a reality. And it's being done today. This is the frustrating thing. It's being done today in a really productive and efficient way, and I see evidence of it. What I don't see is that being applied across a subject matter discipline perspective. So from to read and reflect back on some of the findings from Dame Judith's report, and where are we? September, nearly October 2022, and really, are we anywhere further than in a fire safety perspective anyway than where we were? Well, on one hand, we've made significant progress. We've had 2 acts come through, and on the statute books, we've had multiple consultations. We've got the development of some 33 statutory instruments that will support the Building Safety Act. So a great deal has happened, but at the coalface, are we in a better space with information management in the fire safety sector? I don't think we are. Are we still seeing malpractice for aspects like Regulation 38, yes, we definitely are, because I'm seeing that myself. And do we have a disproportionate understanding of information management as it relates to what is described in the UK BIM framework in fire safety in other areas as well?
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yes, we are. So
great. Yeah,
developing that on knowledge and understanding is absolutely critical, and the starting point absolutely has to be the UK BIM framework.
yeah, and I think that demonstrates. You touched on before the partners for the panel that developed A644, and I guess those organisations that are part of the UK BIM framework, and that leads us on to the sort of those next stages of standards development that again you touched on before, and some of the questions that came in talked about, is there an international standard coming? Would you say is there planned BS for delivering against the whole of the golden thread?
No, and I would be very surprised if we even tried to tackle that.
Yeah.
Let me be absolutely clear, because we've spent a lot of time talking about what the golden thread is. I should probably have also covered what the golden thread isn't as well. The golden thread certainly is not a software solution, and the golden thread certainly isn't something that you can procure as a solution. Such an approach would go significantly against the philosophical approach we are trying to take to building safety information and the use of that information to mitigate building safety risk. And one of the reasons I wanted to hone in quite some detail on the nuances between Part 3 and Part 4 of the Building Safety Act, and as it relates to the golden thread, was you can see, if you look at the breadth of the English building regulations, and let's just focus on the England building regulations for now, a British standard that sets out the information requirements and an information management process for all of the building regulations would be quite some document. That is
Yeah.
quite significant. What I will say is that one of the 4 work streams that sits under the BRAC Golden Thread Working Group, work stream 2, which I also was happy to lead on when asked by government, was to identify some of those standards, international and national standards, by the way, Ian. So this isn't just the 55,000 standards under the BSI library, which you probably won't thank me for pointing the audience in another direction, but what is out there across the international community that can help deliver against some of these requirements. And that information will come forth in future high-level guidance produced by the HSC and DLUC respectively around the golden thread. And I think that's something that will add some additional steer and insight for those looking for a bit more specificity and actually, how should I start tackling this?
Yeah, absolutely, you're right. And you touched on right at the start, this is a 5-year journey. As a national standards body, we'd say with British standards, that's not the norm either. You would expect a British standard could be done in less than 2 years from idea through to publishing. So, trying to then develop those additional standards that are coming behind, really that time frame needs to be sped up too. And potentially the last question here. So in terms of 864, you talked about that cultural change. How will 8644 Part 1 contribute to the much needed cultural change across our industry as described by Dame Judith Hackett?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It will play its part, but it can only play a small part. And we're looking at, we're looking at fire safety in isolation here. And coming from the fire safety sector, and I've been in the sector since I was 19 years old. Stepped into the fire service, left as an officer, practiced and have practiced as an engineer. I have a lived experience. I have a personal learned experience on some of the key cultural issues that, in my humble opinion, need to be rowed back on, redefined, and reconstituted really as best practice. But having been part of some, major change management programs, at an organisational level, particularly in the fire and rescue service, I'm acutely aware of the inherent danger of not having some tangibles to actually hook this idea of cultural change on. So what does good look like when we are assessing where we were to where we want to get to? And we can sometimes get lost in those, again, rather high level and philosophical statements like we need to undertake a cultural change. So when we looked at this in greater detail, not just during the development process of 8644, by the way, but also some of the work that's associated with the Brat Golden Thread Working Group and some of the engagement we've done with other key industry bodies as well that are looking at building safety in the round. It was really clear that we needed to have some defined parameters. And for me, the adoption of some of the British, European norms and international standards associated with the UK BIM framework across more projects and across more assets during their operational phase is something that I think is inexorably going to demonstrate that people are thinking about information management in a completely different way and thinking about the information itself as a commodity. I think I might have used the line already within my presentation. It really is key for my peers within my sector to start thinking about where that information is going, that they are producing, that technical, really good stuff that they are producing within their fire strategies, their fire statements now, of course, as we have them at Planning Gateway 1, their risk management plans. What is that information being used for? What are your clients going to do with it? Who does it need to get to? And if you're unclear on any of that, get clearer. So instruct and push towards your clients the need to be able to utilize that information and think about those ways that you can educate whilst obviously delivering against those requirements that you are being specified to deliver against as well. This ultimately, comes down to that accountability and responsibility piece, which you'll hear, Dame Judith talk about quite regularly, and others as well. And I go back to that line that in amongst all of this is opportunity, if nothing else. We've got a real opportunity here to think about what we do in a completely different way. And BS 8644 for fire safety is just one part of that broader picture that can help to nudge that cultural change along the line. And as I've said to my committee, and I think I've said elsewhere as well, publication doesn't mean the end of this project. Far from it. This is we'll see the rest of our lives out, trying to continue this approach and leave that legacy for those that come after us in this sector. And so we should, because we owe it to the 72 lives lost on June 2017, the 6 lives lost in Lakenhall House, and the multiple deaths that we've seen over residential fires, over the decades, and also firefighter lives that have been lost to building fires as well. So when I talk about cultural change, I often want to get to the nuts and bolts of what that actually is. And for me, having information management at the absolute epicenter of how we think about fire safety design, how we think about fire safety in construction, operation, that life cycle approach is a critical component of how we do this.
Yes. Fantastic. Yeah, it's probably a great place to finish with those words. So I think you're right, and the good thing, hopefully, is that you're starting to see these best practice documents coming out, not just, as you say, for digital fire safety there, but also the competence documents that we now have, and then over, again, talking about new standards, BS 99001, the quality management for the construction industry, that published in July as well. So, you're starting to see, hopefully, these helpful solutions come out to give people a fighting chance with some of these really difficult challenges. So thank you so much for answering those. My apologies to all of the many other people that asked us questions we didn't have the time to answer, but thank you for those. We will look at those. They will find their way to Aman and the committee, and then they will take a look at those after this event. And just as a final wrap up, again, my thanks to you for attending. We said before that these webinars are happening on a very regular basis. In fact, there's one happening in about another hour. So this afternoon, the competence for the fire safety professional with my colleague Claire Price is happening this afternoon, and then 2 on towards the end of October, as you can see there. November, very busy, 29th of November, approved document B, and also our Global Built Environment Conference is around 30th of November and the 1st of December. So lots of opportunity to hear more around these really, really interesting and important subjects. So that's pretty much it from us today. Again, my thanks to Aman for his time and his presentation today. Thank you for attending, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Goodbye.